Hey there, my fellow author. I'm Sarah Elizabeth Sawyer, an old soul kind of writer living my dream as a full-time author and authorpreneur. But I didn't start out living a confident, creative lifestyle. I struggled with the fears and the mental and emotional barriers that so often plague writers at all stages of their author career. But the truth is that with the right knowledge, tools, and training, you can overcome those barriers. I'm here to teach you how I've developed a lifestyle that's allowed me to publish 19 books and counting. Each week, as you tune into the Confident Fiction Author podcast, you'll get clarity on the steps you need to take to advance your writing career. Whether it's developing your ideal writing routine, tackling new skills like dictating your fiction, or overcoming the obstacles life throws your way, this podcast will help you live a more confident, creative lifestyle. Let's get started. Hey there, my fellow author, and welcome to this week's episode of the Confident Fiction Author podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Elizabeth Sawyer, and today I'm going to be talking about how we get it together by getting it going. What if I told you there's just one method to overcoming any obstacle? So, as a fiction author, you may be just a little bit of a perfectionist. You like goal setting and hitting those goals, self-improvement, and just in general, learning the best way to do things. But what if the best way isn't clear? Do you ever feel just stuck? Have you ever experienced analysis paralysis? That's what we're going to be talking about today, and I'm going to share with you how you can overcome that in your writing life so that you can live your best creative lifestyle. If you're on my email list, and you probably are, if you're not, you can join over at fictioncourses.com, get on my Confident Fiction Author email list. But you'll notice at the bottom of all of my emails, I have a little sign off that says Tikba Ihiya, and that's Choctaw for keep going forward, roughly translated. I picked this up off of the Choctaw Foundation's website when I did a lot of writing for them back in the day. They're kind of the nonprofit branch of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, which I'm a member of. And so whenever I first saw that saying and heard the explanation of it, of how it means for the Choctaw people to continue on and for the knowledge to continue flowing through our people and to just keep going forward, I latched onto that as my sign off because that's what I want to encourage people to do. And especially you as an author, to just keep going forward. We have failures, we have setbacks, we have things in our personal and professional lives that just really throw us off track. But for me, Tikva Ihia is that motto to remind us to just keep going forward. And you may want to adopt that as your motto as well, to just keep going forward. Now, I will say going forward can look different at each stage of your life and your author career, but ultimately, the only way to eventually overcome obstacles is to keep going forward. So let's get into this episode and learn how. This idea of we get it together by getting it going came out of my October dictation boot camp. I will credit my friend Molly Reeder, who assisted me during the boot camp with this concept, because she shared during the boot camp, one, how she was experiencing breakthrough with dictation in her own fiction writing, but then she was also talking about how she was frozen between options for her career until her business coach encouraged her to just try one and learn from it. So she had a lot of great opportunities laid out before her, a lot of different directions that she would go, and things just kept getting added to that. And so she was really stuck in that analysis paralysis. And so I invited her to do a Facebook Live video in our private group for the Dictation Bootcamp, where she talked about how she was using that get it together by getting it going to make her decision with her business. And then also how she was teaching fellow authors in the boot camp to do the same thing with dictation, that a lot of them were just stuck in that analysis of which tools should I use, where exactly should I start, and just really encouraging them to get it together by getting it going. And so that became a mantra for us during the boot camp, and I know it helped a lot of authors to move themselves forward in their dictation journey. I also wanted to talk about this because, failure is just a part of the process of success. So if we stay stuck in that fear of failure, we will never progress. So if you're afraid of failure, you will never progress. And that's something that I had to face in my early 20s as a self-starter, as an entrepreneur at heart, then as I became an authorpreneur, and now as a teacher of fiction. Failure is something I face almost on a daily basis, and I have to push past that fear and just get it together by getting it going each and every day sometimes, and facing that failure while I work on the next iteration of whatever it is that I'm writing or that I'm teaching. And I actually recently read a book titled Effortless by Greg McKeown, and highly recommend it. I actually recommend you start with his first book, Essentialism, and then move into Effortless if you're wanting to read those excellent books for helping you develop your best creative lifestyle. But in there, he talks about the first successful attempt at man-powered flight. And so I won't go into the whole story, but I love where he wrapped it up saying, in your own pursuit of what matters, if you want to, quote, build a better airplane, don't try to get everything exactly right the first time. Instead, embrace the rubbish, quote, no matter how ugly it is, so that you can crash, repair, modify, and redesign fast. It's a far easier path for learning, growing, and making progress on what's essential. And when I read that paragraph, I was like, that's me. That's me whenever I'm writing a first draft. It's going to be rubbish at first, and then it will get better with each iteration as I go through my editing process and put the work in to putting together a product that others can consume. And so right after that, he says to start with rubbish. Many of us are kept back from producing something wonderful because we misunderstand the creative process. We see something exceptional or beautiful in its finished state, and we imagine it started out as a beautiful Baby Yoda version of what we were looking at. But exactly the opposite is true. And so when we're thinking about failure, we're thinking about creating that first draft and that messy first draft, just remember, start with rubbish. That is simply a part of the creative process. Okay, so let's dig deeper into how getting it together by getting it going applies to writers. We start off in the idea stage, and you may have just one idea that you're really wanting to write, but if you're like me and like many authors, you have a plethora of ideas. You have so many ideas, you could be writing a new book every week and feel like you won't get them all written by the end of your lifetime. And so when you're in that idea stage and you have all of these ideas to choose from, how do you pick the, quote, best idea? This is especially hard for those of us, like I said, who have lots of ideas, because commitment can be scary. For one, if you're writing a novel, that's going to be a long process. It's a big commitment. It's going to take you time to get written. And you may also feel a sense of loss by choosing one, and therefore you're not choosing another idea that you really wanted to pursue. So there's a couple of things to remember on this. One, you can do everything you want. You just have to get it in the right order. And so one goes back to the stovetop analogy that I covered in a previous episode, number 8, Lessons for Authors from Holiday Cooking, where I talked about you can do everything you want, you just need to get it in the right order. So just because you're picking one story over the other doesn't mean you're abandoning that other story forever. It can be next on your list whenever you complete that book or that series that you did choose, or some authors have multiple series going at one time. But the important thing to remember with that is that you still have a sequence, an order of events that you're tackling these projects so that you don't have multiple unfinished projects that your readers are waiting for. But it's just encouraging to know and helping you make that decision of which one you're going to choose, to know that the other ones will still be there when you get to them. And that's why it's important to remember that this isn't your only story to tell. It doesn't have to be the last one that you tell or the best. In fact, you never really want to write your best book, do you? You always want the next book to be better than the one that you wrote before. So that's picking your idea so that you can get it going. And so with the idea stage, you get it together by getting it going with picking your next idea and starting. Let's talk about how this applies to outlining your story, which is research and world building. And if you're a seat of the pants writer or what we call a pantster, you're still doing this world building in your head, either as you're writing or you may give it some thought beforehand. But for some of us, endlessly researching and world building can be a form of procrastination to avoid actually working on the structure of the story itself, which can be much harder or just feel like a lot of effort. And so it's important to be self-aware of how much research and world building that you're doing, and are you actually getting into the work of structuring your story and preparing to write that first draft. So it's important to have self-awareness, and at that point you may be asking yourself, how much do I have to get together to get going? Like, at what point do you get going with the structure of the story? Where is that cutoff point? Knowing the story you're telling, like the intended character arcs, your themes, etc., will help you define which details are important to know in the pre-writing phase. Also, it's important to understand your genre and the spectrum of crunch that you need in your research. So hard versus soft. So we think about like hard sci-fi and soft sci-fi requires different levels of research and world building. For me, with historical fiction, I have two different approaches to my series. I have the Choctaw Tribune Historical Fiction series, and I have my Doc Beck Westerns series. And those are two very different series in terms of how I approach them for research and plotting and structure before I actually start writing. With the Choctaw Tribune, it's a lot of real Choctaw history set in 1890s, Old Choctaw Nation, Indian Territory, what's now the state of Oklahoma. For the most part, my characters are all fictional and the plot's fictional. The history that I'm using and the culture that I'm using, that's all real. And so I have to do a much deeper dive into my research and my world building for that series. I'm diving into what was that county in 1890 because the county name changed in the 20th century. And I'm diving into the details of the 1892 election for chief and who were the political parties. And how did the railroad run through the nation and at what time and where were the stops and what was the timetable? So just lots of actual real places, real history that I'm having to research before I even begin drafting a novel in the Choctaw Tribune series. Versus my Doc Beck Westerns, which are novellas. So one, the books are much shorter. The characters are fictional. The main character is Omaha Indian. And so with her, I do my research on Omaha history and culture, but it doesn't play nearly the role in especially the early books that Choctaw culture and American Indian history plays into my Choctaw Tribune series. This is much more of a traditional Western feel where there's lots of action, lots of adventure as I follow those characters through that series. So there's not nearly the level of research needed. I'm basically just rehashing a lot of Western plots and putting it into this character who is an Omaha Indian woman doctor traveling the West in the 1890s. So it's a much lighter series, much lighter on the actual history. I am still being accurate in what I do portray in there, but there's just not as much of it. It is more plot and character driven versus history driven. So with your story and with your world building and your research, you will be determining what's important to know in that pre-writing phase and make sure you're not under-researching or over-researching it. There will be that cutoff point, and as you get experience in your story and in your story world, you'll be able to intuitively determine what you need to research and what you're simply using to procrastinate writing that first draft. Which leads us into starting your story. So ideas exist in purity, right? Execution is where the mistakes happen. And that first draft might not live up to what's in your head. And that's what makes it so easy to stay in the idea stage. It is beautiful. It's all put together right there in your head or in your outline, and you don't have to worry about filling it full of holes and mistakes when you actually go to put it down in your first draft. And so it's really important to reconcile which would be a bigger failure: to have that messy first draft, that rubbish that you completed, or to avoid trying altogether. As they say, you can't edit a blank page. And so, honestly, we do have this perfect story in our heads, and to go from head to final published manuscript, we don't really want to have to go through that messy creative process. And we want it to be perfect the first time that it comes out. But here's something I want you to remember. When it comes to a first draft, done is perfect. Now, once you have that first draft and you're getting into editing and publishing your story, boy, this is where fear of judgment from others can really kick in. So you've overcome the fear of choosing your story and writing that first draft, and now you're editing it, and here comes the fear of others, and that can make us avoid publishing or even just seeking feedback, seeking an editor or beta readers who can give you feedback on your story. And so when you're in this phase, and we're talking about get it together by getting it going, so how much do you need to have it together before you get it going down the road to publication? How do you know if your manuscript is ready to pursue publication? That's where that external feedback does come in. It helps bring objectivity in if you're not sure if your manuscript is ready for readers. Just make sure that you get the right feedback. So not just friends and family, that's okay, but get a qualified critique partner or an editor who can give you the right kind of feedback for your story. And now when I say right, I'm talking someone who is experienced in your genre, experienced in the industry. They know what the tropes are. They can give you good, solid feedback. Ultimately, though, you're going to have to reconcile with the fact that there is often no, quote, right way to finish a story and to have every sentence right in order to publish it. Back when I was editing an anthology, I had an author that once I started reading his short story, I knew almost immediately that he was in a class of his own. He was several levels ahead of me, higher than me in terms of writing style and just this poetic gifting in prose. It was a beautiful short story. I made a few suggestions on the historical facts, some things that we might change, but other than that, I was like, this is ready to go. It's fantastic. So I sent him some notes back, and he sent me the draft back. He had changed a paragraph that was beautifully written in the first version. The second version, it was completely different, but it was beautifully written as well. And I was like, okay, great. If you want to change that, that's fine. Here's a couple of other notes and we're about done. So I send it back to him and he sends back, well, I'm still working on this sentence and that. And I was like, no, here. And I had to grab it from him and just say, this is ready to publish. And any other changes you make will be linear and it's not improving the story. And at some point, the story quality will begin to degrade if we continue tinkering with this. And so that's something to remember as an author is you do reach that point where your changes that you're making are more linear and can even start causing a degrade in the quality. And that's happened to many authors. So something to remember when you're trying to get it right in the editing and publishing phase is that writing is not a math problem. It's art. We opened up with talking about failure. So I want to, just as we're looking at this overall with all of the phases of writing a story, something to remember is that it's important to reframe failure. The fear of making mistakes is a form of ego that is silly when you think about it. Of course we're going to make mistakes. We are going to write a really messy first draft. And if you're not, are you getting drafts written? So feel free to embrace the mess, embrace the fact that you're going to make mistakes, that you're going to go through the editing and review process, and just feel the freedom to embrace all of that, to embrace the fact that the more times you fail, the more times you will succeed and the better you will get at your craft. And that also goes back to, you don't want to ever write your best book. You want each book to get better. And if you're holding out on getting it going because you want it to be perfect, you want this to be your best book, is that really even a goal you should be aiming for? Because once you've written that best book, what are the books that are coming after it? So think of that in terms of your first books are not going to be your best books, and you really don't want them to be. And here's another quote from Molly that I personally loved when she said it, and it's that improvement happens with movement. So part of getting it together is mastering that learning curve. And one of the things that can help you with that is measure backwards. So instead of always looking ahead to the goal and trying to attain or falling short of it, instead look back. Look back at the progress that you made. You started with 0 words. You started with no idea, no story. And now maybe you're 10,000 words in or 20,000 words, or you have your first draft written. And yes, it's a mess, but look back at where you started at 0 and where you are now. So you will improve as you keep moving forward and mastering that learning curve. And then always measure backwards. Look where you came from to where you are now. And finally, on reframing failure, remember that perfection is the enemy of done. So I saw this meme, this picture one time with some ducks and some little ducklings, and the quote said something like, "Sometimes you can't wait until you get all of your ducks in a row. You just have to grab what you've got and make a run for it." And I have used that so many times in my writing life and in my author career, especially whenever I'm in up to my chin with research and historical details and what was the name of that county in 1893. And at some point, I just can't wait for all of those ducks to get in a row. I just have to grab what I've got and make a run for it. Get that first draft written and just get it together as I get it going. I want to wrap up here with an invite to my next dictation bootcamp for authors. It's coming up next week. And like I said, this became one of our go-to sayings. We get it together by getting it going. And this bootcamp is your chance to live that with starting your journey and learning how to dictate your fiction. I've seen this with hundreds of authors who come into the boot camp and they really just don't even know how to get going, how to get started with dictation and all the things we talked about, that fear of failure and trying to get it perfect, trying to get it just so, and being afraid of the mess, and just really lacking confidence in their ability to dictate their fiction. So if that's you, I do hope you'll join us in the January Dictation Bootcamp, because that's a place that you can come into and join in with your fellow authors who, guess what? Pretty much none of them have their ducks in a row. We're just grabbing what we've got and making a run for it. And the transformation at the end of that bootcamp is just always marvelous to see. I have authors who say they went from doubting to confident in just a few classes, and other authors who were confident that this wouldn't work for them and found themselves writing thousands of words by dictation toward the end of the boot camp. And then there were others who this was an opportunity to get it going and start their journey in mastering dictating their fiction. The dictation boot camps are always fun, always exciting. There's challenges and failures along the way, but we're there to cheer one another on in this epic journey of speaking words of fiction. And let me just say, dictating fiction is such a powerful experience. It really is powerful to just open my mouth and see words appear on the screen without me having to hunch over a keyboard, and you have issues with your wrist and eyes and for me, back, and all of these health issues that we have to combat as authors, especially if we're in this for the long haul. And when you're thinking about living your best creative lifestyle, dictation is one of the most powerful tools you can add to your toolkit in order to live that best creative lifestyle. So you can enroll in the Dictation Bootcamp for Authors for just $37. It's a live event. Replays will be available if you're not able to make every session. I give you assignments at the end of the videos that will help you get it together by getting it going. And that's over at fictioncourses.com/dictation bootcamp. I look forward to seeing you there. I will also be back next week for another episode of the Confident Fiction Author Podcast. Take care and tikva ihia. Keep going forward.